2, 1.
Let's smell. Let's smell. Let's smell. Smell. Smell.
But welcome.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming in.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Yeah, this has been a great experience to come during this very interesting time. So
It is a very, very interesting time,
yeah,
to say the least.
now it's beginning.
Should we start over? Okay. Tell us when. Okay. Take 2. I believe we had a sound malfunction. So again, welcome to the 2 ferns between 2 people with Yoga Factory Pittsburgh. Kidding. YogaTalks from Yoga Factory Online, and I'm Zeb. This is Dr. Tyler Phan. So again, welcome.
Thank you very much, Zeb.
Yeah, let's try that again. So you have a bunch of different titles and accomplishments, but one of the things that you do right now in Pittsburgh is you're the owner and the runner of Source Pittsburgh.
Yeah, I'm the owner of Source Pittsburgh. I also run an interesting. My son is back there.
He's giving you the thumbs up.
Yeah, it is. I'm also the executive director of the Goldman Institute for Social Research, which is a nonpartisan think tank where we research kind of issues in society and culture, but kind of deal with them in more innovative ways.
Mm-hmm.
So, and one of the big initiatives that we have now is called Critical Dharma. So before Critical Dharma was this kind of gathering where we would have discussions on issues society and culture, utilizing some aspects of contemplative science and kind of trauma-informed care.
Mm-hmm.
But now it's going to be hitting online this Thursday. So we're going to be, first book we're going to research is The Plague, which is a novel by Albert Camus. And after that, we're going to kind of go dive into what is now called Buddhist modernism. So, but yeah, one of the things I research is yoga and meditation.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a medical anthropologist, so looking at it from a medical perspective, but also the social, historical context of yoga and meditation, and kind of bringing these ideas and practices in the limelight through their sometimes controversial histories. So that's kind of what we look at and examine how we can deal with issues utilizing some of these practices, some of these methods.
Yeah.
But also ideas and try to, like, I guess the thing is, there's usually this connotation that is some kind of Eastern mystical thought.
Yeah, like it's magic.
Yeah, like that it's magic, but
Mm-hmm.
if you're getting into any of these ideas, like let's say Buddhism and the many different ideas of Buddhism, you have this really non-mystical, very logical approach on the nature of existence.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so those are like really kind of hard-pressing ideas and have been adapted into like existential philosophy. Even in logical, analytical philosophy now, there's this philosopher named Graham Priest, who's really into what is called paraconsistent logic, with this idea of tetralemma. It's a lot to explain. I'm not going to bore you all out with that, but he's one of the foremost logicians right now.
Mm-hmm.
And he's adopted this idea of tetralemma, which is from the 1st century Buddhist philosophers.
Interesting.
In examining existence.
Yeah. There's a lot of interplay between Buddhism and yoga philosophy, Vedic
Totally.
philosophy as well.
Yeah.
The East was sort of a melting pot right around the switchover from BC to BCE.
Sure.
And there's a lot of common philosophy between a lot of those different schools of thought.
Yeah, and that's the thing. There's a lot of commonality, and there's a lot of these like tensions as well,
Sure.
right? So, I mean, in the typical, what we call Buddhology thought. So it's this, or Buddhist study thought. Even in the Mahayana context, philosophically, there's these two debates about either the Yogacara school, which were more centered on Chitta or the mind, consciousness, or the Madhyamaka school, which is the middle way school, which actually critiqued the substantive nature. So it's like essence or substance, substantive nature of existence, saying that all things are empty, essentially. You know, so that's like a big tension, and allegedly by the 2nd century, things were kind of melted together by the Prasangika movements. But yeah, those kind of philosophies, especially with the Madhyamaka, are adopted now or in the past 30 years in what we call deconstruction or postmodern thought or post-structuralism, right?
Sure.
So critiquing meaning, critiquing like any form of structural existence. You know?
Yeah.
So that's been argued since the 1st century, allegedly.
Yeah. So, not to get too philosophical.
Yeah.
So I was reading in your bio that you started Source Pittsburgh in 2010, originally, and then you took a bit of a hiatus to kind of continue your studies. So you have an MA in Buddhist Studies.
Yeah, so the MA is, well, it was MA in Religion. It's from the School of Oriental and African Studies, which in America, people don't know what SOAS is. But in England, if you're like, oh yeah, I went to SOAS, they're like, oh, wow. It's a very, very specialized university. It's chartered by the Queen. It's part of University of London. And it only focuses on Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. So you have a whole school that has no natural sciences at all.
Yeah.
And only
just focused on them.
Just focused on the cultural and social components.
So that's really some intensive study.
Yeah.
And then you have your PhD also in anthropology.
Yeah, so I have my PhD in anthropology from University College London, which is the university that Gandhi got his law degree, or where Christopher Nolan got his degree, and where Coldplay met together.
Nice.
So it's the biggest research university in London. There's a lot of resources, and that's kind of why I chose it. And originally I was researching Helicobacter pylori in Bhutan, which is the bacteria that causes peptic ulcers in people in Bhutan. So that's what my primary research, but then after that, I started researching Chinese medicine in the United States. Dealing with like regulations and how that kind of shifted. But there's a whole like racial component to it.
Sure.
You know, so.
With a doctoral thesis these days, you have to get very, very specific.
Yeah. So primarily my thesis dealt with the structures of power when it comes to Chinese medicine in the United States. And what I argue is that the structure of powers came from all the way from 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act, where Chinese practitioners could not practice Chinese medicine under the guise of like a physician. They had to be designated as a merchant. So because at the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act, anyone who was not a merchant were deported. So just think about this, 1882 to 1943, Chinese Americans were not considered citizens in this country. So after that was lifted, you also have this unique tension with Asian Americans in the Japanese internment camps, right? So, and just 10 years after that, you see like Jack Kerouac and the Beats writing about Dharma bums while traveling throughout the whole landscape of these internment camps, briefly mentioning, if anything at all. But my big focus in that research was that in the 70s, some primarily white American acupuncturists utilized the acupuncture needle to create regulations. And the first regulation was AB 1500 in California, so Assembly Bill 1500 in California, which basically marginalized any Asian American from practicing acupuncture in the United States.
So Caucasians still could?
Yeah, they could. Well, they could under the auspices of a university, which actually behooved only only 6 of these cohort members
Interesting.
that were part of UCLA.
So they were basically trying to kind of take away, like steal for their own entire practice.
And it was finally lifted under Governor Jerry Brown, who became governor again.
Okay.
Yeah, that Jerry Brown. He lifted it in 1975 or 1976, and it was overturned. But that was actually the first legislation that was ever created, and that specifically, so basically from the oldest records of 1910 to 1976 or 1972, there were only like 6 people ever arrested for practicing medicine without a license, which is practicing acupuncture without a medical license. But from 1972 to 1973, 60 cases of arrest happened just in 1 year alone.
Right.
So, and all of them were Asian American.
Sure.
So this is the unique kind of history that's even kind of trickles into today's regulations and the structure of how Chinese medicine is in the United States.
And so you are, we may not have mentioned this earlier, but you also are a certified acupuncturist.
Yeah, I'm a licensed acupuncturist, so that requires 4 years of education, mandatory. And yeah, basically my dissertation kind of debunked the necessity for that many years of education, stating the counterexample, which is England, that has no regulations at all for acupuncture.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, it's this really unique tension, and that kind of got me to these 2 projects that I'm working on right now, which I explained to you earlier, which is a countercultural Orientalism, which kind of tracks like a little bit from the Theosophical movement at the turn of the century, the latter part of the 19th century, all the way up to like the beat, to like the hippie movements, like American counterculture, right? And seeing how it like trickles even today's society.
Yeah.
So where it becomes this dynamic, it's this view, this gaze, G-A-Z-E, on how to understand how we understand the quote unquote East. You know, I mean, if you ask any Asian that like, oh, well, is there such thing as an East? Well, first question is, where do you draw the line where East and West like delineates? Then the second question is that like, you know, are these cultures, do they share a commonality? And it gets really complicated and really tricky. And the answer becomes much more convoluted. So, but there's this like idea of what we have, of what the East represents.
Right.
And that's what's complicated.
Yes.
So,
in your view, like as an anthropologist and as an acupuncture practitioner, is acupuncture quote unquote healthcare?
Yeah, I see it as healthcare. It's an interesting intervention because, like, from the position of the patient, it does a lot of good for people. As I'm writing like my monograph now, I'm finding that the more you know about acupuncture, the more you like don't know how it really works.
The same could be said for yoga.
Sure. Yeah. So it's like I'm to a point where in July I will be practicing to some degree for 20 years. You know, since I was 15 years old. And I find myself at this really interesting crossroads where it's like, okay, I learned basically the primary systems of thought, the traditions in America, right, in the United States. But I really don't know how it works. You know, from a biomedical perspective, that's one paradigm, we can get into that. But also from the paradigm of like, you have some theories that are like one specific point treats X, Y, and Z. And then you have another system of thought was like, well, you treat what looks like that area on the opposite side. Let's say like this looks like a mouth. So you treat this because it looks like a mouth. You know, so you have these various ideas and schools of thoughts and traditions.
Right.
And it kind of debunks all your idea that there's just one Chinese medicine. There's one acupuncture.
Sure.
You know, but I think what it shows and what's unique about something like yoga, meditation, acupuncture, Chinese medicine in general is this issue of like giving people space, giving people the ability to be heard, right? And that's what's kind of missing. I think that might be a missing link.
Yeah.
Out of so many missing links.
Yeah, especially in our modern society where everything is just go, go, go.
Totally.
We're stuck in our screens all day. We never give ourselves space or time just to like reset.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's something to be said like this. One thing that I'm finding, especially with COVID-19 happening, is that there's many various symptoms and there's many things that people don't know, right? There's asymptomatic people, then there's symptomatic people, and then people deal with this virus in many different ways.
Right.
So this illuminates the world of what is now called in the professions of medicine as a whole, individualized medicine, right? And individualized medicine is how acupuncture operates, how Chinese medicine operates. You're not doing this one kind of formula for everyone. You're kind of looking at a whole slew of things. People can call it holism, which we can get into that if you want. But there's all these different elements to it that are in place. And it's with the understanding that people change.
Yeah.
Things change. You know, that's what makes it difficult for me that I'm finding as an acupuncturist for this long, and doing herbs too, is that one thing might work for someone that has the same symptoms but has like different presentation, then you gotta kind of tweak it, you know,
for another person.
So that's similar with like yoga meditation too.
Very different though from like a Western medical perspective, where it's like these symptoms get this treatment.
Sure. Yeah.
You're actually like addressing the person as a whole.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I found out when I was researching Helicobacter pylori in Bhutan, is that you had these patients at the biomedical hospitals that were getting the H. pylori eradication protocol, which is the gold standard, right? But still having symptoms, even years down the line. But they're finding kind of treatment from it, or alleviating the symptoms through traditional intervention, you know, so what's up with that?
Yeah.
And then, you know, one of the big arguments, you're like, well, it's culturally embedded, but that's the thing, is there's a lot of things that are culturally embedded in our way of doing medicine, right?
For sure.
So like when you're calling your doctor, you're already creating some cultural attitudes on the standard operating procedure that's accepted within your culture on how to treat something.
Right.
Yeah.
So sort of taking that idea of, you know, is acupuncture healthcare? And it's this ancient form of treatment. Can we apply that same train of thought to breathing technies and yoga asana and stuff like that?
Yeah, so this is kind of the experiment of like the 20th century for yoga asana, because a lot of it, if y'all aren't familiar with like Mark Singleton's work, and also especially Joseph Alter's work, who's a professor at Pitt, he's my colleague, especially Joe, who argued that physical culture was a huge like frame of reference in creating what we know as contemporary yoga, which is postural yogasana.
Right. That's a really interesting point, because if you research yoga at all, you start to realize that what we think of yoga as in the West, which is the postures and the breathing, you know, stuff like meditation, is really just the smallest speck on the radar of yoga, you know, as a whole.
Yeah. And the thing, I mean, if you find that yoga is without history, so believing that there's an ahistorical nature of yoga, you're gonna run into some issues, because like yoga has always changed. Like I said, I name dropped Yogacara school. They had nothing to do with like postures at all. Right? They argued that all things are mind, and that can get into like anything like this chair, which is called panpsychism, believing that all entities have consciousness. right?
Mhm.
Like that's some deep stuff, But even in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, the first lines is yoga is the cessation of the movements of the mind,
Mhm.
right? And how does that even go about? And there's all these slews of practices that are kind of goes into Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, but very, very little on asana, on
Right.
postures.
Right. Even in the sutras, there's very, very little mention of the postures
No,
themselves.
and there's practices, but these practices are like, well, so there's 5 dynamics of the mind of chitta.
Mhm.
Some of them, the 5 turnings are it's like wisdom or intellect, but also like error, and dreamlike thinking, illusionary thinking. These are all elements that you're like, whoa, what? That's
Yeah.
pretty wild. Like,
It's some deep philosophy.
yeah, it's deep philosophy. And that's the thing is that, and this is the big thing I'm writing in Counterculture Orientalism,
Mhm.
is that the focus is no longer these kind of abstract philosophical ideas, but they're these practices,
Right.
which is really unique. I
Yeah.
mean, the Beatles didn't go seek out TM, Transcendental Meditation, for the ideas.
Mhm.
They came to seek it for the practices. So there's this materiality, there's this material plane of existence
Right.
that people are searching for.
When did that start to happen, that shift?
Oh, that's a deeper question. And that's what...
Maybe that's too much for today.
No, it's not. So I think the first remnants of it in the United States, at least,
Mhm.
was with Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophical movement. So the Theosophical Society of the United States, or of America, was the first kind of push. Now, I want to be really cautionary about the Theosophical Society because Madame Blavatsky was also a huge proponent of what is called Ariosophy,
Hmm.
which is this romanticization or romanticism of Aryans.
Okay.
You see where this is going?
I do.
Yes, and that is exactly the trajectory of where that came about, and deeply rooted into so for example, her big thing about Ariosophy was that Aryans came from Atlantis, of course, and then not only that she got a lot of her wisdom from the Tibetan masters. And somehow these Tibetan masters transitioned to, Indian, Himalayan Tibetan masters, what she called Mahatmas,
Okay.
right? That gave her secret wisdom,
Mhm.
right? And this is actually the first kind of instance where you see the translation of the word prana, right? And she didn't perceive it as breath. She believed that there's this magnetic sphere.
Yeah.
And that these Mahatmas had these access to these magnetic spheres of existence.
Interesting.
So
Mahatma is sort of like a great soul.
yeah,
Right?
yeah, sacred soul,
Yeah.
So what's unique about that is that was kind of the Theosophical Society, who actually Doubleday, I forgot his first name, who was some will argue is the founder of modern baseball,
Okay.
was the president of the Theosophical Society when Madame Blavatsky and Olcott, Colonel Olcott, fled America because they were outed by all these Sanskritist and Polytech Society members. I believe it's Coleman was his name.
Were they sort of like frauds?
Yeah, they were total frauds.
And this was in like the 20s?
No, this was actually late 19th century, so late 1800s,
Okay.
right? There's a trajectory to this, right? So what ends up happening is they go to India in 1885, right? And they start on their new quest of proselytization of what we now know as New Age, right? Into India, adopt members and cohorts to that. And then in the latter part of Madame Blavatsky's life, settles in London, and that's where the Theosophical Society came and died.
Oh.
Yeah, well, took off with this new ideas,
Mhm.
and that through those publishing houses started adopting all these translations of yogic texts.
Interesting.
Right?
Mhm.
Because everyone kind of branched together. And I guess you can say this is like the first time this kind of mysticism of the East, right? This kind of first, like, it's actually technically a second wave of Orientalism, because before that you had like chinoiserie and all that stuff. But this is like the kind of interesting counterculture Orientalism that comes. So this is like the first wave of a counterculture Orientalism that comes about. And that adopts like thinkers like Yogananda, right? So the autobiography of the yogi guy, right? He comes in on the auspices of the American or Theosophical Society of America. And that starts launching into like getting this postural yoga in by the 30s, right? From
Krishnamacharya. Yogananda, I think Vivekananda came over.
Vivekananda, too,
yeah. And probably one or two other really famous.
Big time Yogendra or anyways, there's all these different leaders in what we identify as yoga today,
right? And
a lot of them came from Mysore, right? So, and I guess you can trace most postural yoga. This is what Joseph Alter writes and Mark Singleton writes. That can be all traced to these Mysore schools, and specifically with a man named Krishnamacharya,
right? Who some say is like the father of modern yoga.
Yeah, and there's a lot of cred and there's a lot of backing to like legitimize that claim too. But yeah, as yoga as we know, unless you go to India, because if you go to India, the kind of star of like yoga is Swami Ramdev. Like he's on every billboard. He's on
in modern yoga.
In modern yoga in India, and he has very dodgy views on like homosexuality, and like he's, let's just say he's a very controversial figure. Yeah. But he is like the rock star.
But he filled stadiums.
Oh yeah. The first time I experienced yoga in Delhi was under a pranayama, what he called pranayama, or pranayama workshop. Yeah. At a cricket stadium. It was completely like packed, hundreds of thousands of people, literally hundreds of thousands of people
just
in Delhi.
And
it's really cheap. It was like the equivalent to like $2 just to do these breathing techniques in simple postures.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. His political stuff, not so cool. Right. But with him gave rise to Hindu nationalism, right? Like what you have with President Modi today, right? And the Hindu nationalist movement. Yeah. So there's
also pretty sketchy.
Yeah, which is definitely pretty sketch, where prior to COVID-19, there were riots because of the immigration laws of disallowing Muslim Indians or Muslim migrants to be Indian citizens. Right. So there's that whole shtick, and so eloquently Modi has kind of shifted yoga into that, saying this is our cultural heritage. But if you deconstruct, what is yoga, then that's
a big question.
Big question, right?
Yes.
So, but if you believe yoga is some ahistorical, without history kind of thing, okay, sure, why not? Yeah. But nothing's like that,
right?
So.
And the people, I just spent 6 weeks in India, and the people that I was studying with there, there are these Vedic texts that go back thousands of years, and like some of these books, they're a couple thousand years old, and they state that yoga has been going on since time immemorial. So who knows how long it's actually been?
Yeah, and this is one of the things I teach in my classes. Like I teach Asian medical systems. The big thing we teach is basically yoga, meditation, Ayurveda, Chinese medicine, and Tibetan medicine. We're about to wrap up actually right now. But what I teach is that the term yoga in itself has constantly changed.
Yes.
And Sanskrit in general is a polysemic language, meaning that one word can mean a multitude of things. Like even the simple term dharma, right? Dharma can mean so many things. It can mean a foundation of a house. It can mean the foundation of like your words, the structure of your words. It could be like law, but it could also be the Buddha's teachings, right? Or a teaching of some. So that's what I'm trying to get at, is that when you're trying to like, even the term chitta, right? Even it's mind, but it could be consciousness. could be thought,
Mhm.
could be like the processes of how your brain works. It's so many different things. So when you're getting yoga, which could literally mean like the yoke of two oxen,
Mhm.
two agricultural animals, but also to bind,
Right.
right? Two disparate objects, two
Mhm.
different objects, it could be like the physical reality to the abstract reality, that kind of reified process. Like
Mhm.
it's a multitude of things.
Right.
So,
Depends on who's interpreting it.
yeah, and at this epoch in today's society, we interpret it as this postural thing,
Right.
right?
Right.
So, 1,000 years down the line could be completely something else.
Sure.
So.
But it's interesting that, as a concept, and like you say, that may have changed over the millennia, but somehow it's still around.
Yeah, something is still around.
Yeah. Maybe it's just the tiniest bit of.
Yeah, the tiniest bit of iota. Maybe this is where we can get into, this is where YogaTalks would say, yeah, that's the mind. And that's what's transmigrating. Because remember, Buddhism is an anatma movement. I mean, they don't believe in a soul. They don't believe in a self. But they believe in a consciousness, right?
Mhm.
So that can be what's spread around, right? And we have a consciousness, even like on a more simple level, right? When you say America, right, or our founding fathers and what they fought for, right? People have an idea
Right.
of what that may be.
Right.
And that kind of cheetah of America has transmigrated throughout time, into what we idealize it today.
Right.
Maybe it's a hit snidbit of it,
Yeah.
right?
Most of which we know from Hamilton. But.
Yeah. From Hamilton, of course, So this is the unique nuances of it, and it can get really complicated, but something is happening. And I'm not trying to disqualify a court. I'm definitely not saying that yoga has no practicality.
Sure.
Because what it has done to people is have people realize their own bodies.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So getting back to that idea of creating space,
Yeah.
creating a moment where somebody can process all the stress,
Yeah.
all the whatever that's going on, and they can start to feel better.
Yeah.
So is there a connection between something like Chinese medicine and acupuncture and yoga asana?
Well, it's really fascinating because, one of the things that I find is really unique. This is not so much so for yoga per se, because like I said, yoga has a multitude of different practices and stuff like that. But in Ayurvedic thought, right, there's the idea of doshas, right? Doshas has been really mistranslated. People think it means like humors. Well, not even the Greek people had the idea of humors. It's the French. This is like 17th century, 15th, 17th century idea of thought, right? But what doshas, the root of dosha is dus. Dus, since Sanskrit is an Indo-European language, dus has a similar prefix, which is dis, like in dystopia, dysentery, disease, that's kind of, or disinfectant, that kind of stuff, right? And literally, dosha means disease. It means fault. It means some kind of impurity. Some people even say sin, right? But that at base level is how they meaning Ayurvedic practitioners, see the body, because form is the first element of disease. Can't have disease without form, right? So in that aspect, what I'm understanding, and the same thing with Tibetan medicine, the three assemblages is called Nyepa Sum. Nyepa means same thing, fault, disease, whatever. Sum just means three, right? So you have this three, these assemblages of disease, and that's how you structure the body. Where I'm trying to go with this is that, this will relate into trauma-informed care too, is what I see, at least as a practitioner. I don't see health, because I don't really know what health looks like at all.
That makes a lot of sense.
But what I do see is disease. I see the body, inevitably, we're gonna die. and as practitioners of health medicine, we just try to mitigate that kind of suffering for the inevitable, right? But the body is continually decaying and dying. Ayurvedic practitioners understood this.
Just got really grim.
Yeah, sorry. But this is also educate your on understanding of the nature of reality.
For sure. Yeah.
Right? And the nature of reality is all, at least in the Buddhist context, which Bhagavata, who wrote the Ashtanga Hridaya Samhita, which is like the first Ayurvedic text that brought in doshas, right? He was the son of a Buddhist monk, right? So that got into this idea of the impermanent world. And that what is the first noble truth in Buddhism? All things are suffering, right? I'm sorry, y'all, if you get into Buddhism, it's not for happiness. The thing is to try to relieve suffering.
It's not all rainbows.
It's not all rainbows,
yeah.
So in this time of turmoil right now is not the worst time to practice. It's actually the best time to practice and to understand what Buddhists and Jains and Hindus all practice is karuna, which is compassion, right? That's the one element that these kind of philosophies have together, is to be there for each other, to go beyond yourself to help other people, right? So in understanding disease as a healthcare, which is your original question, yeah, it is. But that extends to many different things. I believe yoga is healthcare as well, right? And some will argue that, if done correctly, there's very little, especially for chronic pain. Because that's the thing with acupuncture, is that in Chinese medicine, we are good at dealing with chronic pain, So, and, bless all the doctors and nurses and healthcare practitioners that are combating the virus right now. That's the first line of defense, Afterwards, there needs to be triage, and that's where we come in. And this is how we can help people deal with the suffering of their bodies, with their lives, and etc. So if anything, through the experience of yoga, is to give self-care, but also to help people in need. That's the overarching gap.
Yeah. I like that idea of compassion that sort of runs through all these different philosophies.
Totally, yeah. And the Buddhists have an interesting way of understanding compassion, because they say, since they're an anatma movement, they're a non-self movement, they're a non-soul movement, the biggest embodiment of non-self or non-soul is compassion. Because you're going beyond yourself to help others, no matter what the consequences are. So all these people that are having things exist for ourselves to be in good health right now are risking it all, right? Literally, for a better good, for a greater good of things, So that's definitely one thing out of all this, which is really terrible. And maybe, hopefully after post-COVID-19, things will create or illuminate the world of compassion and selflessness.
Yeah.
That we're all capable of it. Especially in times of need and disaster.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely something that I hope for, in the midst of all this crisis and everything that's going on, is somehow on the other side of it, that there's a brighter future, that we learn something out of this experience as a collective.
Totally, yeah. Yeah, and there's all these elements that can get us there. Even taking a walk, even communicating with your friends,
right?
Even this kind of exchange, we do what we can, but those things matter, But it also, out of all this, shows the fragility of the world.
It really does.
And how things, just a little microscopic, unseeable thing, can totally cripple economies, societies, cultures. Force us to.
And how so many times we were living our lives and we just believe that everything around us is we've set everything in place and we're exactly where we want to be, and just one little thing can shake it up.
Just change everything. Totally.
So to live a life of compassion and to be of service starts to become more and more important.
Yeah, yeah.
When you start to realize that everything around you is just temporary.
Yeah, it's the nature of impermanence, right?
Mhm.
It's a little bit expedited than normal right now.
Yeah.
But hopefully this things is what teaches us things is that we're in this together.
Yep.
I mean, it's spread it because we're together technically, but we're all in this together too.
Right.
As anthropologists, we look at things, especially like dynamics and patterns of weird things like viruses, and see how they function. But also reflects on how, like, we as a society and culture shows our vulnerabilities, but how we also function as well.
Mhm.
And what I've seen from all this experiences, though it's been horrible for a lot of people, is that it brings out a lot of good people too.
Yeah.
And hopefully it lasts. And I think more so than ever as we progress into it, the more thicker it is, the more we ought to like show,
come together and like find that sort of like maybe like raise the vibration as a race.
Totally. Yeah, totally.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, even when it comes to food now, right? Our relationship with food completely changes.
Yeah.
I mean, you go in the supermarket now, you see how much things have changed,
Mm-hmm.
So, hopefully practices will change on that. Hopefully the compassion will rise from that. But, we're in the thick of it, right? In the Four Noble Truths for Buddhism is that you got to go and acknowledge that life is suffering. And then the question is that what is the nature of suffering? Then is that, there's a way to stop this suffering. It's a multitude of ways, but you ought to have like the right mindset, the right thought, right action, right? That comes from all these healthcare workers doing their job, saving people's lives. It comes with like right insight, right thought, right intellect, right?
Yeah. So
right view, and then inevitably will lead to the path that leads to the cessation of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, though that formula that the Buddha had 2,000 something years ago, 2,500 years ago, has applicability today, right? It's a very logical like system, I mean, it's changes, it's very heterogeneous, but on a whole, that like all things are impermanent. Okay, I got that, right? All things are suffering. Got that too. It's like, I mean, the third market of existence, all things are empty, so that's one of the things that is the other element is that the life we live, the substantive life that we create, the more we attach onto that material realm. And I don't mean like materialism, like, I have a fancy car or whatever. It extends to that. But our material existence, and what we create and what we think as reality has completely shifted with this.
Yes.
And that's what Buddha teaches. That material realm constantly switches. May sometimes longer than others. But it's happening.
Well, in yoga philosophy, there's an emphasis on non-attachment. I think it's a very similar thing.
Totally,
because the more you get attached to the physical things around you, the more that they start controlling your life.
Absolutely. And in Buddhism, there's the idea of Trishna, which means thirst. It's like the thirst of you're in a desert and you're that thirsty, right? That kind of desire and attachment. It's applicable to our daily lives. Habits that we create. So those kind of things are very present. Even though it's written at least like 2,000 years ago, those things are all applicable today.
Right.
And how we understand the nature of our existence.
Yep.
So, and especially dealing with health and medicine, you have to understand that the bodies are always changing. No matter as human bodies, like viral bodies, right? This goes with the impermanent nature of all things, right? So, best thing to do to that too is adapt with it and be impermanent as those elements are as well.
So taking that idea back to this sort of like yoga as therapy, yoga as we see it in the modern world. So in the circa like 1920s, 1930s, all these people, yogis came over from India
Yeah.
and started sharing this new wave of yoga,
Yeah.
which was much more focused on asana.
Yeah.
And that's sort of like where our modern yoga world sits right now. It's like it's very focused on asana.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of meditation and mindfulness, and there's a tiny bit of spirituality sprinkled in.
Yeah.
But because we're so focused on the actual postures, asana is basically a posture. And you know, the pranayama, the breathing techniques, how does that affect our health in a positive way?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it does. I mean, a lot of, if y'all aren't familiar with Joseph Alter's work or Mark Singleton's work, they wrote extensively on this, that most of the asanas today are influenced by European gymnastics, right?
Fascinating.
If not entirely, the corpus of contemporary asanas today, especially sun salutations was a complete adoption of like European gymnastics.
When the Europeans were sort of colonizing and not invading, but they were.
So this is more or less like they already invaded.
Yeah.
British colonialism, especially,
Yeah.
was already there, right? But as an anti-British, anti-colonial movement, these different elements of yogis or yoginis even adopted these practices as to create the ideal body, right? This is where physical culture comes in. Physical culture now is called bodybuilding, right? But where physical culture comes in to understand the ideal aesthetic body, not only as a body of impurities, but of strength, and of strength to fight against British colonialism. So that's the unique turn of all of this, right? Is that their whole element is to say that we have these strong bodies, but to fight against British colonialism, right? So that's why it's really adopted, even in today's narrative of Indian like nationalism. Right? That's the big element of it. Right?
Yeah.
So these perfect bodies, these strong bodies, you know, are kind of the Templar of what you see as this kind of like not just as of being healthy, but as a symbol of resistance.
Yeah.
Right.
And rewinding a little bit, as like to my knowledge, asanas, which translates roughly into like a seat.
It's to sit. Yeah.
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 They were originally practiced in order to quiet the body, so people could sit and focus the mind.
Yeah. So
and really like get deep into like noticing the inner workings of the mind.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's an element. Like this goes to, you know, the first line of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is that yoga is the cessation of the turnings of the mind, the workings of chitta.
Right.
Right. Whatever that is. And there's many different turnings. There's 5 specific turnings in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. And yeah, that's an element of it. What is yoga? The yoga in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, right, is not postures at all. Right. So there's only 4 postures. They're all sitting down, literally. Right. You know, but today, what we see it is that, you know, it is when we're doing these, I guess you could say exercises, right? They're calming the mind. Yeah. And specifically for the American mind, right, that's constantly ruminating, doing all these workings, it helps you focus on, oh man, I'm in this crazy posture. That kind of hurts right now, you know? So it gets you back into your body, and also understand the nature of the mind. Right?
Or starts to, at least.
So inadvertently, it does what it does in the Patanjali Yoga Sutra. Yeah. But, you know, not explicitly. Yeah. You know, but the point of Patanjali Yoga Sutra is to be a good person. You know, here's the rule, here's the ways to being a good human being.
Right, the yamas, the niyamas,
yeah,
all laid out there for you.
Totally, yeah. And I mean, and that's what, you know, so going back to like the 20s and 30s, right? The purpose of this was to create an ideal Indian body, right? Because this was the height of nationalism, not just in India, throughout the world. My people, Vietnamese people, we had our own like nationalism as well. Right?
Yeah.
Like as Ho Chi Minh said, he's a nationalist first, communist second, right? Japan, yeah, Germany,
Yeah.
China, you know. So these are the elements that you see. This like growing wave that also align with the human body, right? So that's why when I teach Asian medical systems, especially for like yoga, the turn of the 20th century, early part of the 20th century is monumental in understanding not only bodies, but understanding national bodies.
Interesting. Yeah.
You know, we have that today. Like we have the aesthetic of what the American body is, though it's definitely changing, you know. But these elements are pervasive in our culture. We just don't really identify it yet, or as such,
Right.
you know.
Right.
And
It's
that's
masked by advertising.
yeah, and that's by advertising. Like, you know, I mean, we're in the yoga environment, so like companies like to, you know, push like yoga pants, but there's an aesthetic to that. There's a whole aesthetic. There's a body culture involved with that as well.
Yeah.
You know, and the tradition y'all are in, it comes from BC Ghosh, right? And BC Ghosh, who for some of y'all don't know, was one of the first physical culturalists or bodybuilders in India.
In India, yeah.
Right? So, and he was a huge follower of Eugene Sandow, and he was like the Eugene Sandow of India, right? So, and that kind of came along because a lot of these physical culture courses, training classes, were taught at YMCAs, right? And the unique thing about YMCAs is the triangle and the Y. What does the triangle represent? Mind, body, spirit.
Interesting.
So like there's a whole history that's attached to that into like what some people identify as New Age, but that kind of current, right? There's definitely an interesting, what I identify as Orientalism involved with that, right? It's not good or bad, it's unique, you know? And that uniqueness is really interesting to push these cultures forward, you know? And it does, you know, doing yoga here, other places, it has immense effect, at least on my body, you know. But also we should put the cautionary out there. If you do it incorrectly, you might hurt yourself as well.
Right.
You know.
Especially right now with like every yoga studio and gym everywhere going online.
Yeah.
It's really tricky because you're doing something without a teacher in the room watching you and taking care of you.
Yeah. So that's the element that, you know, I personally like techniques first and getting into techniques of each posture.
Yeah.
These postures have, you know, our historical moment on these postures, these asanas, is that they create an arrangement of our body and stressors of our body, but making us being aware of our body, you know. And I don't just mean like Shavasana, but I mean like all the different postures. If anything, it teaches you this interesting kind of body awareness. That you normally don't have. You know?
There are a lot of different studies out there, but you know, a lot of people have focused on the effects of the mind that like yoga practice has on the mind, and you know, they found that it actually increases your neuroplasticity, where you can actually like start to form new neural pathways just by practicing asana and, you know, focusing your breath. Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and that's the big element that, like, for me, I'm into breath, right? And the whole element of breath, right? Even in the Buddhist context, like of Satipatthana Sutra or the Satipatthana Sutta, it's literally sati is what people have identified now as mindfulness, right? But it literally means to recollect, to remember. It's the Sanskrit word is smriti. But in the Satipatthana Sutta, it teaches you to breathe in and telling your body, breathe in, just like this is you breathing in, and exhale. This is your breath, exhale. that simple. But even that basic practice, you can call it meditation, you can call it whatever, that practice is forcing you to do the most basic involuntary things, all involuntary, voluntary things.
Yeah.
So that you can live.
That's the interesting thing about breath.
Yeah.
It is involuntary.
Yeah.
We do it whether we think about it or not. But when we focus on it, it can really shift everything.
Totally.
Like when we really figure out how to control our breath, it's a game changer.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's great. I mean, like, my son Ashok is outside, but like Daniel Tiger, man, like he has one of the best meditations that I've seen. And it goes like this: is when you feel so down and you want to roar, take a deep breath and count to 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that is the Satipatthana Sutta.
That's some classic Mr. Rogers.
I know, that's some
awesome.
classic Mr. Rogers. And like that in itself embodies just like, yo, remember to breathe.
Yeah.
Remember? And that, I like that kind of remember. I like that better than mindfulness. Because it's like, yo, remember the most basic stuff that you have, right? And that actually is Thomas Rod Davis, brief side note, Thomas Rod Davis, he's the founder of the Polytech Society. He's the first one to translate the word sati, the Pali word sati, which in Sanskrit is smriti, into mindfulness. Right? Monier Williams, he translates smriti to mean recollect. But Thomas Rod Davis, for some reason, he translated it to mindfulness.
When was that?
That was the turn of 20th century, early or late 19th century.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the idea of mindfulness is actually a very modern.
Oh my God,
concept.
yeah, completely.
Interesting.
Yeah, and if you look at any of the Buddhist practices around Asia, what's one thing they have in common? They remember all the teachings. And they're reciting hours at a time all the teachings.
The same is true for India.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that's the important part about the Vedas.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The Vedas, you need to listen and recollect.
Right.
And you recite. Smriti, that's why Smriti becomes an important component of the Vedas. That's how it survived, right? Because it was passed by transmission, oral transmission.
It wasn't written down originally.
It wasn't written down. Same with Pali. And Pali is really interesting because Pali has no written text. It's all phonetic. So there's Sinhala, which is Burmese Pali, Sri Lankan Pali, there's Burmese Pali, there's Thai Pali, there's Devanagari Pali, and then there's English Pali, which is what most of the Polytech Society writes. And it all adopts the language, the written language, to transmit the different teachings. So, I mean, that's actually how Buddhism spread so rampantly in South Asia, right? It's because of Pali.
Yeah.
Right? And that's where it gets kind of messed up in the North Asia, where there's weird translations there's not as much cohesion. There's like Chinese translation of Mahayana texts. There's like Tibetan translations, not so much Indic translations that survived, but like then China goes into Japan, etc. But that's the problem. Is Sanskrit is written through Devanagari. Pali, on the other hand, is phonetic, so it can attach to any language, right? Yeah. So that's what's unique, and this is where going back to recollect rather than like mindfulness. I don't even know what mindfulness is, because most of the mindfulness that we understand as mindfulness comes from Jon Kabat-Zinn and his mindfulness-based stress reduction, and that protocol that's clinically based. You get what I'm saying? So like, if you're trying to understand that nuance of what mindfulness is, well, the big question is, what does it actually mean? Right. What does it mean to be mindful? Because according to Jon Kabat-Zinn, is just to allow thoughts to appear in your brain and not having any judgment to it. But that's the point, is to have discerning judgment to things, to do right action, right speech, right? So it's very like, and it's not opposition, but it doesn't align with a lot of Buddhist teachings, which Jon Kabat-Zinn got most of these practices. Yeah. What MBSR is based on. Yeah. So that's the unique kind of element of it. Interesting. Yeah.
So you are really a big proponent of breath and breath control. the word pranayama, prana is breath,
Yeah.
or sometimes it's translated as life
force, yeah.
energy, and then yama is sort of a like control.
Yeah, retention control.
Yeah.
So in the Bhagavad Gita, which is part of the Mahabharata, and Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, they talk about pranayama,
Mhm.
but it's literally holding your breath or retaining your breath
Mhm.
in that context,
Mhm.
right? What we see today in all these practices is very different,
Right.
But if you actually look through Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, that term pranayama, or pranayaha, right? It's interesting because it kind of illuminates that it's this retention of breath.
Mhm.
That things arise from that, right?
Yeah.
The cessation of the turnings arise from the cessation of breath,
Mhm.
right? Which is really unique.
Yeah.
It's. I mean, in the Pali Canon, there's a kind of contraindication that the Buddha talks about, where you don't do any forceful breathing. You can cease all bodily functions, that's fine. But like forceful breathing is no bueno,
Mhm.
no es bueno for them.
Yes.
So that's the kind of unique element of it. But the point of the matter is that there is breath involved with all these things.
Yeah. I saw a really interesting translation once. Instead of like breath control, they were actually calling it like life force extension.
Mm.
So it was using your breath to actually elongate the span of your life, or at least build more energy throughout your life.
Totally. Yeah, and there's a lot of validity to that,
Yeah.
It's how you choose to live your life in a fulfilling manner. Because I see this very cautionary, because I know a lot of Qigong teachers and Tai Chi Chuan teachers, and they're all about breath control and stuff, but they smoke a lot of cigarettes. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And they end up dying really early.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, it's respect to yourself, and you respect yourself on breathing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You do that every day. At the very least, I don't care what deity you worship, but you understand one thing: if you don't have air, oxygen, you're gonna die.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the key element that we're forced to live in this material reality.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There are some things that don't really change that much.
No. So I mean, but there again, lies this kind of interesting issue of and why I brought up Madame Blavatsky is because she believed that prana was more than just breath. It was some magnetic force or etc.
Mhm.
Right, in the ethers.
Mhm.
I need to emphasize ethers.
Yes.
So, but that kind of thing, in a way, got us to where we're at today. To understand, okay, wait a second, Madame Blavatsky wasn't all there, but what came out of that is these whole other different, what we call heterogeneous kind of thought processes.
She helped create the space
Yes,
for
or
that.
the impetus.
Yeah.
The impetus.
Yeah.
Whether if it was about to arrive or not. And what I argue in counterculture Orientalism is that these people, through mostly white Americans, came through cheap airfare, had access to these different ways of thinking.
Mhm.
The biggest question that I'm at is this idea of enlightenment. It's really hard for me to value.
Yeah.
Because in America or in the West, quote unquote West, the hallmark of modernity is enlightenment. And that's through rationality, empiricism, scientific method, right?
Mhm.
That's, by the way, when Nietzsche said God is dead, he doesn't mean that God is dead. It means that scientific rationality, modernity has overtaken truth, capital T truth, from metaphysical belief, right?
Mhm.
We're living in a weird world now where it's the opposite. It's not opposite, but as an anthropologist, we already knew this. It's called relativism. That there's no capital T truth. That's what we try to examine. What are the different truths that different cultures have?
Right.
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 But people will understand today philosophically as this is post-modernity,
Mhm.
where truth has become deconstructed.
Yeah.
Right. So
Well, even the small t truth.
Yeah, even
is
small
in
t
question now.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely. Because
People
once
don't
you
know what to believe.
yeah, and and it's fine, and it's totally fine. When like nothing has substantive belief, then it frees you up to everything. That's kind of what I'm at right now. Like as an anthropologist, I read RCTs, randomized controlled trials, meta-analysis. I'm like, oh, this is gravy. Okay, p-scale, which is the determinant of like the statistical probability for a sound like clinical trial. But the p-scale in itself is socially constructed, right? It's totally created. Like 0.05. Who developed that number? Well, it was developed in the 18th century. Okay, or 19th century, or I think 18th century. But like, someone just developed it. They determined 0.05 as like a sound like clinical trial. They forget that there's also the ethics committee, ethics board, IRB, internal review board, institutional review board, right? These things are all socially constructed. So that's kind of when I'm an anthropologist, it kind of leads these kind of problems, But for me, I'm like, these problems are great. It helps us problem solve. And when you're open to new ideas, it illuminates a whole different world for you. I always find astrology interesting. Whether it's true or not, I don't really know. I don't really care, but I find it really interesting.
It is. It's fascinating.
It's really fascinating.
Astrology sort of originated around India as well, thousands of years ago.
Totally.
And my teacher that I was in India with was telling us the story about how there are these ancient astrological texts that somebody that knows how to navigate them can, just by knowing, how astrology works these days, like your date of birth, the time you were born, a couple other things. But if they read through these texts, they can tell you pretty much your entire life, what's going to happen. So pretty accurately.
This is the thing about Vietnamese astrology, and this is our worlds in like East Asia and Southeast Asia. Like in Vietnamese culture, like the day you're born and etc. is a huge determinant of your existence. Like that's why a lot of people were having kids the year of the pig last year. Because it was a golden pig.
Very auspicious year.
Very auspicious year, as we can see. We're going now, but things aren't as auspicious, But like this is the element that if no matter what people don't believe, it exists. And no matter like as much as you try to tell people it doesn't exist, the more value it has for other people for making it exist. Right? I mean, you can say
which can be said for any line of thought,
anything.
Philosophy.
I mean, Hegel called that dialectics, right? So like those kind of oppositions and those kind of equilibration of those oppositions are how things function, right? To go that far, So I find all those things interesting, and I'm kind of open to it because as an anthropologist and an acupuncturist, one thing that it taught me, those two things, is to listen to people. First and foremost, you listen to people, hear what they gotta say, how they interact with you. That comes with like this recollecting of who you are. You're just a piece of matter in this world, right? But to make something out of it, you interact with other people and other things, and make sense of your world at whatever sense you want to create it from it. You create it by interacting with different people and then understanding different narratives. So.
Absolutely. And it's such an interesting time to be in the world right now. And I think what you were saying about just being open and being curious and being compassionate, like all those different things will help us navigate the next couple months, the next couple years. Who knows how everything's going to turn out. But if we can just keep our center and breathe, and be compassionate
to others,
be open,
totally,
it's going to serve us moving forward.
Absolutely. And that's what I told people is that what's most dangerous in this virus itself is the reaction to this virus, the potential of the reaction to this virus. If we can cultivate compassion, understanding for each other, and like calm down the animosity that we're in this together.
Yeah.
You know, then that we can really, squelch a big fire that might be raging.
Mhm.
You know, so and I hope we can all cultivate these kind of different ways. There's not just one single way, but multiple ways of interacting.
Yeah.
In a more positive manner with the limits that we have.
Yeah.
You know.
Absolutely. Tyler, I think our time is up.
Yeah.
But thank you so much.
Yeah,
for being
thank you,
here.
Deb. Yeah.
We covered a lot of ground today.
Yes. Yes.
So you can check out more Yoga Talks at yogafactory.com. And, keep in touch. If you have any questions for me or for Tyler, feel free to email us, info@yogafactory.com, and have an awesome rest of your evening. We'll see you again next week. Namaste.